webinar on cold storage and root cellars. My name's Emily Becker, and I work with Rural CAP, the Rural Alaska Community Action Program. Our mission is to empower low-income Alaskans, and we're presenting this webinar along with the Tribes Extension Program, whose mission is to promote food sovereignty and security among Alaska tribes. And part of our educational programming here is just about different ways to shore up food security in your own community and in your own family. So that's where our webinar is coming from today. And we're very happy to welcome Sam Knapp, the owner of Offbeet Farm in Fairbanks. He is an expert in cold storage and food cellars. He's got a master's degree in plant ecology, along with some very cool, interesting hands-on life and educational experiences. And really, without further ado, I will turn it over to Sam. Please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll make sure, I'm going to monitor that and make sure those get answered. So thanks, everyone, and welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about this topic. This is something that I've been working pretty intensively on for the past at least 7 years. So currently I own Offbeet Farm in Fairbanks, Alaska, and the farm itself is about 1 acre in production, and we only do wintertime sales. So I'm selling from about October through the end of April, depending on the weather. And in that photo in the background, you can see that building, and that's our cold storage building where we keep everything through the winter time. This past fall, we put about 22,000 pounds of veggies into storage, and I'm continuing to sell them through a winter CSA, and I do some wholesale to stores in Fairbanks. I didn't start out in Fairbanks. I'm from Wisconsin originally, and I had been farming for other people for a few years before I started my own farm in Michigan for the first time. And doing winter storage wasn't something that I initially planned on. It kind of happened, and I just didn't have enough time in the summer to run a traditional farm. And so I kind of got pushed into doing this winter model, and I found that there's a lot of demand in the wintertime, and people were very excited about getting veggies locally through the winter. And so I've just kept with it. It's something that people get excited about and I feel passionate about, and I'll just keep on refining my techniques as I go. So let's jump right in. So in Alaska, there are a bunch of veggies that are applicable for long-term storage. I've kind of broken these up into groups here. Some of these, I mean, of course, there are other storage crops. I think sweet potatoes is a good example, and I know that people are growing sweet potatoes as far north as Maine, but I don't quite think we can eke it out here. Maybe you could in the high tunnel. So if you want resources on sweet potatoes, reach out later. But pumpkins and squash, of course. In the group of squash, I know that in Fairbanks we have a hard time with butternut, and that's a light issue. We also have some issues with acorns and delicatas. You can grow them, although you're not going to get the yields that you could further south. Of course, the alliums, we have onions and shallots, garlic and leeks. Those all grow great here. Onions, there is a problem with certain storage varieties of onions aren't light adapted to this far north. And so if you grow a long day onion, for example, that's adapted to, let's say, 50 degrees north, and you grow it in Fairbanks, a lot of times what you'll see is the onions mature too early and you'll end up with small storage onions. Red wing is a variety that I've landed on and I use as my storage onion. It's the only one that I know of that's adapted to 65 degrees north and is a storage onion. You can get, of course, sweet onions like Alyssa Craig is one, and Walla Wallas are another, but they might only store a couple months as opposed to the others, which you can store for 6 to 8 months sometimes. Cabbage is not a big surprise. On that list, Brussels sprouts and kale might surprise you. Although I do count those as storage crops. You can only keep them for maybe a maximum of 2 months and maybe the right conditions. But it is nice to be able to get greens. For example, I sell kale greens at some markets in December, and people are excited to see them there. You get some of the classic root crops, carrots, parsnips, celeriac, beets, and sunchokes. Those are also known as Jerusalem artichokes. Those are a great storage crop that some people may not be familiar with, but they're pretty aggressive perennial, but they are tasty. And then potatoes are kind of in a group all of their own. So in this talk, I want to stress that there's a difference between the way that I do things and the way that you might do things as a home scale gardener. Not everything that I do at a commercial scale is something that you might want to do at home, but I'll try and point out some of those differences. But there are a bunch of overlap and things that I think anybody growing crops into the wintertime should be thinking about. When we're talking about harvesting, I think timing the harvest is really important for getting storage crops, getting successful storage crops. I advise people, or I encourage people to harvest as late as they can. And there's a couple reasons for this. When you are harvesting late, it means that your crops are going to spend less time in storage. And so you can usually keep them for longer into the winter or spring. Another really important thing is that by harvesting late, you're usually harvesting cold crops. Keeping crops cool is one of the most important things you can do, bringing them in that will prolong their storage life. And usually a rule of thumb, if I'm harvesting and it's above 40 degrees, I really want to get those crops cooled to below 40 degrees within at least 24 hours of harvesting them to maximize their storage life. But it's easy to do this, for example, if you're harvesting and it's 38 degrees outside, the crops are already there. So it's not something that, for example, if you're storing crops in a traditional root cellar and don't have a cooling system, you can use the weather to cool the crops for you and get the best storage life that you can. This table here is a chunk of something that I'll share all of later, and you can use this resource. It's something that I published in a magazine a few years ago. I think another thing to pay attention to when harvesting is thinking about the cold hardiness. So you want to harvest things as late as you can, but you also don't want them to be damaged by the cold. In this figure here, the snowflakes, like one snowflake means that it can tolerate some frosts, but you definitely don't want it to freeze or experience hard frosts. Hard frosts, it's kind of a subjective thing. Many people point at 28 degrees as kind of like the borderline between an easy frost or a light frost and a hard frost. I think it's a little more nuanced than that. These veggies that have just one snowflake next to them, kind of their main feature is that most of them is above ground, maybe with the exception of leeks, which you could really cut off the upper portion if they were damaged. But rutabagas, beets, cabbages, they have a lot. Well, cabbages are entirely above ground, but they have a lot sticking up above the ground surface and are exposed and vulnerable to freezing temperatures. So any prolonged below freezing temperatures, and I would get these veggies out. Beets, for example, if there's freezing on that beet surface, you'll see some pock marking later on that will breed mold growth pretty quickly in storage. I think potatoes are another one that are worth paying attention to. You can push their harvest pretty late. The foliage, it's okay if it dies back. And in fact, you want it to die back. But the tubers themselves, if they're exposed to frozen ground at all, you'll see softening and freeze spots on the potatoes that really don't do well in storage. The winter squash and the pumpkins are something that I try and not let them be exposed to any frost at all. Sometimes with good leaf cover, you can get away with it, but it's not something that I like to risk. Let's see. Another thing about bringing in crops is that you want them to come in as healthy as possible. This is a photo from my first farm in Michigan. And in this year, we had an issue with a fungal disease on our cabbages. And I was able to bring these cabbages into storage, but I needed to peel back all the damaged layers and just bring in the healthy portion. And so if you are faced with like insect damage, in Alaska here, we have a lot of cabbage root maggots out there. So if you have portions that are filled with cabbage root maggot holes, I mean, you can bring them into storage, but you just have to know that they're not going to last as long. You can trim some of those portions off in some cases, but again, the crops aren't going to last as long. If you see any fungal diseases, just trim off as much as you can, but try not to bring anything that's really diseased into storage. Another
Sam,
kind of piece of this.
can I stop you for a second? I got a
Yeah,
question.
totally.
Just going back to your cold hardiness chart.
Yeah.
So since you're in Fairbanks, do you think that applies all over Alaska? Someone was asking about, would this apply to Southeast Alaska as well? Or maybe if you know of where this person could find resources specific to that area.
Yeah, I think all this information is applicable to the vegetables themselves and not where you are. So yeah, cabbages are going to be damaged by freezing, whether you're in Petersburg or Nome. So yeah. Let's see.
So Ian, just checking in with you. Does that answer your question, or do you want a follow-up to that?
No, that's great. Yeah, and that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. So thinking about harvesting things as late as possible, and sorry, thanks for that question, Ian. One of the biggest thing, or I think, yeah, one of the other really important things is to make sure that you're bringing in mature crops. Over on the right side of the page where I have this list that size matters, that there are a bunch of crops where their physiological maturity really doesn't matter as far as bringing them into storage. Cabbages, for example, if you bring in a really tightly packed, tight head of cabbage, and you bring in a loose head of cabbage that's small, it really doesn't affect their storage life. The small cabbage will last just as long as the mature, tightly packed cabbage will. And that goes for many things. Small carrots will last just as long as large carrots, and that goes for all of these vegetables. The one exception is kale. You can bring anything into storage with kale, but the small immature leaves nearing the top of the plant are going to be the ones that will last the longest in storage, whereas the larger, more mature leaves that have kind of unfurled fully, those will last a very short time in storage, maybe sometimes just 2 weeks or so. So when you're bringing kale in, and you want it to last, the best way is to get the immature leaves towards the top of the plant. But the other crops on the other side of the page, it really does matter when you bring them in, and they need to be mature in order to do well in storage. So how can you tell when they're mature? Well, with squash and pumpkins, there's a couple things that you can look for. I mean, the classic is corking stems and dieback of the main plants, but in Fairbanks here, we don't often get weather. Sorry, my cat is all over the place. We don't often get weather that is conducive to seeing those fully corked stems before we get frost, but the squash still might be mature. So things that you can look for is that the rind of the squash will go from looking kind of shiny to getting this kind of waxy appearance. And along with that, in immature squash, there are very tiny hairs that cover the surface called trichomes, and those will be gone on a mature squash. You can also take some, if you have enough of them, you can sacrifice some pieces and cut into them early, and you'll see that in an immature squash or pumpkin, often the flesh hasn't really fully turned orange yet. It'll be a lighter shade of yellow, and this isn't with all varieties, but many that have this deep orange flesh, you can tell if the flesh is orange that they've reached maturity. Onions are a big one that if you don't let them fully reach maturity, they will sprout in storage. And the foolproof sign is that their tops have fallen over on their own. Sometimes you can get them before their tops fall, And if you go and squeeze just at the crown of the onion, where the neck meets it, if you squeeze the neck and it gives a little bit, it's softened up and starts to feel kind of hollow, that's a sign that the onion is nearing maturity or very close to it. The top will fall soon and is putting resources into the bulb, and ready to dry out. Garlic, kind of a similar thing to onions. Garlic, you can usually tell based upon the leaves. So coming up from the bottom, when about half the leaves have turned yellow and dried up, garlic will be ready to harvest. If you're in a really wet zone and have issues with fungus, you might also try and dig up some garlic if you're afraid to leave it in the ground too long. And you'll see that nearing the crown, like an immature garlic, the crown will be kind of torpedo shaped, whereas a mature garlic, you'll see this really developed shoulder shape. You can even cut into them and see that the cloves are fully filling out the wrappers, and that's a good way to tell that garlic is fully mature. Potatoes, they need to, for best storage, they're going to need to have some kind of curing time, which we'll go over. New potatoes are the ones that you harvest in the middle of summer, and they don't last very long in storage. And kind of the difference between new potatoes and fully mature potatoes is that the upper portions of leaves have begun to die back on mature potatoes, and they begin to set their skins. And you can force that process if you need to. If you need to, let's say you had to plant late, you could chop back the foliage either through mowing. Some commercial growers will torch their potato leaves to kill them, or the plants to kill them, and force the tubers to set their skins. But you should be waiting at least 1 to 3 weeks after that dieback has happened to harvest fully mature potatoes. Sunchokes, if you're growing them, you're going to want to wait until just after a week or so after the first frost. Don't wait too long beyond that, because rot can kind of come down that main stolon that's going into the sunchoke tubers, and can cause them to rot early, which is bad. Okay. One last thing to touch on, I pulled this is a big chart that I pulled from the National Weather Service. It is the average, or the annual mean temperature, sorry, the daily mean temperatures for Fairbanks. So you can see that across the top there is the months and then the day of the month, and what the mean temperature is. So the average of night and day temperatures. Something to pay attention to when you're planning out your harvest is, if you're growing squash, you're going to want to watch when your daily mean temperatures drop below 50 degrees. For squash and pumpkins, anything in that family is going to be injured by temperatures lower than 50 degrees. It's an exposure and like a time exposure thing. So if it's only for a couple days, it's not a big deal. This damage occurs over weeks. But if you're really trying to maximize your storage life with those, you're going to want to grab them before their flesh temperature is dropping below 50 degrees. And that temperature really closely follows the daily means. So you can plan for it by looking at a chart like this, which you can find from the Weather Service, the past climate data and averages. Another thing you want to pay attention to is, I've circled here, is when the daily means drop below freezing, because that's when the ground starts to freeze. And that's when it's going to start to get difficult to harvest certain crops. That's when certain crops are going to start being damaged by the cold. You can, and I've done this, you can harvest carrots and parsnips out of frozen ground. Their shoulders might be damaged a little bit with carrots, but it's just no fun. You don't want to be doing this. And so if you can, try and plan your harvest to get it in before, on average, you're going to be reaching these temperatures. But then every year is different, and you're going to have to be watching the weather closely, and making sure that you have enough time to get everything in. So when you're harvesting, there's a few things you need to do to prepare something for storage. One thing you need to do with many of the root crops is trim off their foliage. This is a beet I'm trimming here. Most of the, I guess, the classic root crops, your carrots, your parsnips, your celeriac, turnips, rutabagas, they all have this foliage growing out of the top of the root, and you don't want to bring that into storage. I like to think of it like cutting fingernails, where you want to cut the fingernail, or the petioles in this case, as close as you can to the surface without cutting into the quick. And with many of these veggies, their stems are shortened into the top of that root shoulder, and so you just don't want to be cutting into the meat of the root veggie itself. I think a weird exception with that is rutabagas and some turnips. Rutabagas are one of the few classic root crops where the stem kind of elongates out of the top of the root, and so it's okay to cut into the stem in this case, just leaving yourself, an inch and a half nub of stem on top of a rutabaga is fine. When you're cutting these foliage, or this foliage off the plants, I like to do it in the field and just leave that material behind to be incorporated next year. I used to take everything out and try and compost it separately and then bring it back in, but it ends up being so much work that I question why I was doing it, and then just leave everything in the field to be organic matter. I guess unless you have disease or insect issues that you're really worried about, there's no really reason to be taking these things out of the field. Another thing that you need to, apart from trimming, certain crops need curing in order to do well in storage. I think a classic one is pumpkins and squash. So in the lower 48, kind of in the, I think like the classic New England fall, people can get away, and farmers can get away with curing pumpkins and squash in the field. I can't do that here in Fairbanks, and I imagine most of you can't do that because our falls are just too short, or it's too wet. There's just not that sunny fall time in order to cure and harden their skins. And so what I have to do is I have to do the curing inside. So I'll harvest my squash and pumpkins and let them sit out in the sun as long as I can, but it's usually only a day or two. So in order to cure their skin, so it's hardening that outer waxy covering and getting moisture out of the stems, I keep them at right around 80 degrees and 50 to 60% humidity for 1 to 2 weeks. So I'll do that with, I've done it with space heaters, I've done it with propane heaters, and then running a dehumidifier and a fan, just kind of circulating air throughout that. Whatever, as warm as you can, as dry as you can, under cover for a couple of weeks will really improve the storage life of your squash. An exception to this I should mention is that if you are managing to grow acorn squash, they don't like to be cured. It harms them. They'll turn yellow early in storage, and lose some flavor, which isn't great. Onions and garlic both need to be cured. These, you can bring them inside as full plants. You can bring them inside with part of their tops ripped off. However you choose to do it, you're going to want to leave them with good air circulation in a warm and dry place for anywhere from like 3 to 5 weeks until the whole plant is dried down. And you won't be seeing any green on them anymore. Their outer scales will feel papery. The necks will be fully dried down. I guess the warmer you can get it and the drier you can get it, the better. But I'm usually doing this in the attic of that storage building where the temperature isn't controlled and it's just dry and it gets kind of hot in there in sunny days. Potatoes are another thing that appreciate being cured. The curing process in potatoes heals their wounds. So if you have nicks from harvesting, those will set over and not encourage mold growth and storage. Oftentimes people cure potatoes exactly where they're going to store them, and they'll slowly lower the temperature afterwards, but you can do it however works for you. The best curing conditions are anywhere between 55 to 75 degrees and around 80% relative humidity for a week or two. The lower the temperature, the slower they're going to cure, but you'll also have fewer fungal issues. And so if you see fungus or some mold growing on your potatoes and they're starting when they're curing, lowering that temperature will help with that. Washing is a big thing that I had so many questions about when I started farming for storage. I had always read that you shouldn't wash your crops before you store them. And I think that is true in some cases, but if you're nailing storage conditions, getting them cold enough, you can really wash your crops at any time. So all of my crops that need washing go into storage fully washed. I use a barrel washer. This is something that many farmers use. We can put a lot of material through in a relatively short amount of time. But you can also use things. When I started out, I was using spray table. This is just like a 2x4 frame with some hardware cloth spread over it and just spraying the veggies until they're clean. So like I said, you can wash at any time if you are getting your storage conditions cold enough. If your root cellar or wherever you're storing your kind of cold loving veggies is getting, I don't know, maybe above 38 or 40 for a long period of time, I wouldn't advise washing your crops before storage. There's just too much moisture and potential for damage introduced during the washing process that having that warmer temperature kind of puts you in danger of those injuries and moisture and fungus and everything causing issues. And so if you're able to keep it cold, wash anytime. If you're not, I'd say go ahead and wash after storage when you're pulling things out. Kind of along those lines, you're going to need to pack things into storage in some way. Again, before I started as a farmer doing this at a commercial scale, I was unsure. I read all this stuff about packing root veggies into sand or newspaper or peat moss or all these wet absorbent materials. And I think that works. But if you're doing thousands of pounds of something, it's just not practical anymore to do that. So the way that for example, I store my cold loving crops in big containers. For specialty stuff, I'm using like 27-gallon totes with a bunch of holes for air circulation. The other photos from a farmer friend of mine who's storing all of their winter squash in well-ventilated containers. This is a look inside the totes. I usually have some kind of absorbent material on the bottom. In this case, it's peat moss covered with just chunks of old floating row cover. You can use anything you want. I think brown paper has worked really well as an absorbent material. And I'm usually putting crops into these containers wet and then letting them dry for a few days before I'm closing up the containers. But the containers themselves do have a lot of airflow. The thing I can really advise you not to do is if you're using some kind of semi-enclosed containers, make sure there's airflow. If you're closing it up tight, you will see rot happening. That is a theme I've seen for myself and every farmer I've talked to who has experimented with storing veggies into the wintertime. Bad things happen when you close things up entirely. So make sure there's a little bit of airflow, but you're always going to be fighting this battle between your storage room conditions, the humidity, and whether or not your veggies are drying out. So this is one strategy a farmer I know uses to keep their veggies in kind of a semi-air permeable container. These are like 50-pound grain sacks that they're storing their roots in. So it lets a little bit of air through, but it keeps the moisture in, which is the important part. This farmer's storage room is too dry compared to the conditions that we'll talk about later. And so if he had his veggies sitting out in the open, they would turn soft. I mean, you can eat soft veggies. It's totally fine. In fact, I'm a big advocate for desiccated floppy carrots. I think they're the best tasting ones in the world because all the moisture is gone and the sugars are concentrated into the root. But that's not what a lot of people are looking for when you're looking for a nice crunchy carrot in the middle of winter. So a container like this, keeping things semi-enclosed, creates this kind of humid microenvironment where you can keep your veggies with all their water nice and turgid, nice and crisp, without having a fully humid storage room. My storage room, this is a photo of mine earlier this year. I'm using super sacks. So it's a woven polyethylene bags that can hold, anywhere from 700 to 1,200 pounds of veggies per bag, depending on what we're talking about. I leave those bags open because I'm able to control the humidity in the storage room to make sure that it's humid enough. But it's something that I'm kind of constantly watching. I'm looking at the veggies on top of the bags and checking that they're not softening up, while also adjusting the humidity. And I'll talk about that in a second. So everything that I have in this storage room is something that on this next page falls into this top blue category as far as what they like for storage conditions. I've called those like the cold and damp group. You want to store these as close as you can to freezing. So like riding right around 32 degrees, and then keeping the humidity as high as you can. So I'm trying to keep it as close to 100% as possible. Now that does create some moisture issues in the storage room, and you need to have it built in order to handle those kinds of things, because you're going to have condensation no matter what you do on the inside of the walls with a very, very humid and cold storage room like that. The alliums, so like onions, garlic, shallots, they also like to be nice and cold, right around freezing, but much, much drier. Ideally around 65% relative humidity. And the issue with those, I think if you aren't able to find the right conditions for onions and garlic, dry is more important than cold. You should be able to store onions and garlic, for example, maybe even up to 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, so long as they're dry. The storage life won't be quite as long as it could be, but it will be much better than if you store them cold and in a very humid environment. They really don't like to be humid. Potatoes, also very humid. I call them cool and damp. They don't like to be as cold as the other kind of classic root crops. You can store them, I have in this figure, up to 45 degrees, but I think anywhere between about 38 and 45 is ideal for them. The colder you keep them, the sweeter they're going to be. Because they convert many of those starches to sugars, and so you'll taste that sweetness the colder you're keeping your potatoes. I know that like chip and fry companies, they're keeping their potatoes 45 degrees and sometimes warmer to avoid those sugars from forming, so that they don't turn brown or black when they're fried. But that's not something that most of us have to worry about. Winter squash and pumpkins, you want those to be relatively warm and dry. I think anywhere between 50 to 55 degrees is ideal for those, and right around 60% relative humidity is good. The main thing with those is you need really good airflow around them. Any buildup of humidity on their skin, or not fully getting the stems or peduncles to dry out fully, you're going to have issues with rot. Also in this chart, you can kind of see estimations for storage lives, and this really depends on what varieties you have and your conditions for keeping them, but it gives you an idea of what the potential is for some of these things. And I'll make sure this PDF is available after the presentation. So how do I control climate in my cold storage space? Through a couple ways. I'm really focused on temperature, humidity, and then fresh air input. Temperature I control early in the fall. I'm using air conditioners that have been hijacked by these CoolBot units. You might be familiar with these. It allows you to use a residential air conditioner as kind of a refrigerator, and get them to cool a room down to as low as about 34. So I have two air conditioners, big ones, that are controlled by these CoolBot units to keep my storage room around 35 or 36 when I'm bringing things in for harvest. And then after that, I'm using this series of thermostats. Just got them on Amazon. They're pretty simple, but they're plugged into each other in such a way that they're watching both the inside temperature and the outside temperature, trying to keep the room right around 32 degrees by bringing in cold air from outside. This photo I took at, it was 26 below out, and the veggies in the storage room were still generating enough heat that I was needing to bring in cold air from outside to keep the room at 32. It's pretty remarkable how much heat a room full of veggies creates, and you need to be constantly cooling it. So this is just hooked up to an intake fan that's bringing air in through a duct. And then along with that, you need to be worrying about humidity. In the back of this photo is, you can see down by the floor there where I'm moving my mouse, there's a commercial humidifier that's just gravity fed by a bucket full of water, and that's controlled by a humidistat. Again, just from Amazon, they're less than $50. And this is keeping the humidity in the storage room as high as I can get it. And something to note is that if you are using a humidifier to humidify your storage room, the wicking type that you can get at, fairly cheaply at most stores don't work very well above about 90% relative humidity when you're approaching freezing. You really should be getting the misting type, which I know they also sell at most stores. So if you're looking to get very, very high humidity at cold temperatures, look for a misting type humidifier. This commercial one is a fogging misting type, but it can put out a lot of moisture into a fairly big room.
Hey, Sam, do
Yeah.
those totes have, so the totes have holes in them?
They do, yeah. And I've every year I make the holes bigger because I don't think there's condensation on the inside of the containers, and I think they need more airflow. So if anything, I think right now my holes are maybe 5/8 or a 5/8 drill bit, and I think I'm going to take a hole saw next year and make like 1-inch holes, just to get more air into these things, because I see more problems with rot caused from condensation and moisture buildup than I do from moisture loss in this case.
And where on the tote are the holes?
Everywhere.
Okay.
Yep.
And just confirming the snowflake with the slash through it.
Oh yeah. And we'll get that when we get to the I've got the full image later on, but
Okay.
the slash means no frost. Frost
Okay.
will hurt it. Anything else?
Let's see. Heidi asks, why not just use the crate type bins like the tan ones? Oh, yeah.
Okay. I find that, well, I don't have enough of them. They're often pretty expensive, and I've managed to track down another set of 20 of them, but I just don't have enough of them. You can see in the back of this picture, just poking, I'm pointing with my finger here, I'll point with the mouse, just poking out from the back here, I have this set of wire containers, which I keep kohlrabi in, because they really, really don't like being in an enclosed space. And I can only get away with this though because the humidity is high enough. And I find that even most farmers, in addition to most home gardeners, aren't keeping the humidity high enough in their storage rooms. And so you're going to need to have some kind of enclosed or semi-enclosed container to retain the moisture. But again, I do want to stress that like keeping roots packed in damp sand or another damp material, that totally works. And I completely encourage you to do it if you are okay with going through the extra work of packing and unpacking those things. It is a time-honored tradition that absolutely works. It just isn't practical for a large commercial scale.
And then how many holes per bin approximately in the black ones there?
I don't put a specific number. I think like I said, I'm going to be adding more and making them larger. So I would say, space them out every 5 or 6 inches. It's really a feel thing, unfortunately. If you're seeing a lot of condensation when you open up these bins, you'll see it on the top of the lid or on the underside of the lid. You want more holes. Okay. So this is just like a general takeaways for in storage, things that you want to watch for. You want to always be watching the temperature and humidity in your storage space. Having like what's the word I'm looking for? A thermometer. Having a thermometer that allows you to remotely monitor what's going on in there is really handy. So if, obviously you're not living in your storage space, this lets you know if it's getting too cold or too warm and be able to fix those problems when they come up occasionally. You're going to want to watch for veggies softening. That means they're drying out. So if they're drying out, then your storage room is not humid enough, it's too dry, and you're allowing too much air in. But you also want to watch for condensation and wetness building up on the inside of your containers as well. That means they're not getting enough airflow. And you might have issues with rot from that. Oftentimes you might be playing a game between opening or slightly opening containers and closing them just to kind of find the right balance between air coming in and losing moisture to a dry storage room. You're going to want to watch for signs of rot and if possible, remove those bad pieces because they will infect the pieces around them. This isn't always possible. Many veggies, if you're storing them in containers, you can't see what's going on in the middle of the container, and that's just the way it is. But things like squash, which you're often storing in single layers, you can watch for bad pieces. Just check them periodically. One thing to note, though, is that sometimes you'll see mold and surface blemishes or blemishes on the crops that are just on the surface. And just because you see a little mold on something doesn't mean that it's totally going bad. You may be able to trim off that section and have the rest of it be fine. Cabbages are a great example of this. You're putting them into storage, ideally with an outer wrapper leaf or two to protect them. And you can have a big spot of mold and rot on a cabbage and peel off 2 or 3 layers and have a pristine cabbage head underneath. So just note that if you see things going wrong, it's not the end of the world. But along with that, you should expect to lose things. On my farm, I build in my planning. I expect to lose anywhere from 10 to 15% of what I bring into storage. And I just work that into my planning. If I don't lose that much, it's great. And if I do lose that much, it's also fine because I planned for it. It's just a part of keeping veggies. Even if you do everything perfect, you're still going to lose things to rot, and it's okay. And lastly, just enjoy your storage. Enjoy tasting those fresh veggies from summer long into the cold, dark winter. It's a wonderful thing to be able to walk to. My wife and I'll call it the grocery store. We're walking down to the grocery store to grab veggies from storage, and it's wonderful to enjoy those things all winter long. This is the main chart and what with a little bit more information on it. Everything from like how to trim and size that you want to look for maturity. Although this is a little bit more aimed at commercial growers, but we'll just make sure that this is available after the talk. That's all that I have for now. I'll open it up for questions. One more thing to say. I imagine that some of you may be asking about or wondering about building storage spaces. And my one thing that I want to make sure that I say I wrote down for myself is if you're insulating a storage space, don't use fiberglass. Fiberglass, inevitably you'll get condensation on it and it'll mold, it'll lose its insulating value. So use rock wool, foam board, spray foam, anything but fiberglass. Okay, now I'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Sam. Awesome info. I think just to start with, someone was wondering, can we have a copy of the whole slideshow? Would you be willing to
Oh
let
yeah,
us?
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so here's a question. If you see mold or blemishes, for example, on a cabbage, should you remove the leaves and continue to store or and leave it be and trust the outer leaf to protect the rest of the cabbage?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that I've noticed that if you leave a rotten spot that's on the outside of on the outer leaves of the cabbage, if you ignore the problem and just leave it in place, it tends to work itself inwards. Whereas if you catch it and remove a layer or two to expose a clean cabbage underneath, that will store longer. I think the exception is if the rot is in the butt end of the cabbage that you've cut earlier, it will tend to work itself in no matter what you do. And you should probably eat that one sooner than later.
Great. Another question is about fruit. Do you store fruit for the winter and are below ground root cellars feasible in Fairbanks? Two-part question.
I do not personally store fruit, and in my root cellar, there's reasons not to. Um, Fruit gives off a lot of ethylene gas when it's in storage, and that will cause things to, not all things, but some things do not appreciate being exposed to ethylene gas. And so just as a blanket rule, I mean, it's more nuanced than this, but I just generally wouldn't store fruit in the same space that I'm storing veggies. And yes, below ground root cellars absolutely can work in Fairbanks, so long as they're insulated well enough. I have friends with below ground root cellars and they work just fine.
And Abigail, I know there is a cooperative extension video that gives a tour of a below ground root cellar. I think it's in Fairbanks. Maybe if Heidi, you could post that video. And sort of related to that, someone was asking, or actually Monica was saying she has a primitive off-grid root cellar with no temperature humidity controls. What advice do you have somebody just like home grower, not ready to set up this kind of thing?
Yeah, totally. And I think this is probably most people. In that case, I really advise her to think, like to plan out when she's going to harvest so that she can harvest as late as she can, so that the veggies are already cold and the root cellar has already naturally become colder when she's putting things into storage. Those spaces are often difficult to keep humid enough, and so I would either advise doing some of the more traditional methods like sand or newspaper storage, or if she's wanting to wash things before she puts them into storage, to use some kind of semi-enclosed container like a tote with holes in it or like a woven bag.
Great. Next question. Do you have any trouble with pests?
During the growing season, absolutely. During storage, no. And I think storage, I don't have problems with pests because the building has concrete walls and there's not really ways that they can come through. But during the growing season, I absolutely have meadow voles are all over the farm. I deploy an army of traps every year, and I'm constantly, I must trap 200 voles a year or something like that, just to keep their populations down. We also deal with, an array of insects. I think cabbage moths are probably the biggest culprit, but we also do have onion root maggots are here as well. It's something that you need to consider.
Sounds like you might need an owl box.
Yeah, I thought about doing an owl box or even a kestrel box, but cats work too.
Yeah, cats. Well,
Yeah.
well, anyway. Anya has a question. Anya, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Hi, Sam.
Yeah,
I worked for Sam. He's a great farmer, great guy, great employer, and also very humble. So I wanted to ask, he has been writing a book about all of this work that he's done researching storing crops throughout the winter. And I wanted to ask you about when your book is coming out and how people could get that.
Thank you, Anya. That was very kind. Yes, the book right now is in the editing process with the publisher, and fingers crossed should be should be published sometime this fall. The publisher is Chelsea Green, and I'm imagining that well, of course it'll be available online, but I'm hoping to get it into some of the local stores that I already sell at, like the Roaming Root and the Co-op.
Awesome. That sounds great. Definitely a book I would buy. And that actually leads to my question. So, a lot of farmers rest in the winter. So when do you rest?
Yeah. I think it's something that if you're interested in doing winter storage commercially, that you need to go into with eyes wide open, that this style of farming doesn't give you the same rest period that most other farmers have. But by just growing winter crops, I would say that my summer is not as stressful as other farmers who are going to market and constantly prepping sales and things like that. So it just spreads the workload more evenly throughout the year. That said, I do find that right after harvest, I have a couple weeks when I'm not selling, and after the root cellar is cleaned out at the end of April or mid-April, I have about a month of relative rest before things really get underway, but those are usually spent planning. So I think it makes a farmer's job more closely resemble a normal job, as opposed to having a very intense growing season and then a bunch of time off where you're recovering from that period.
Thank you.